I've seen plenty of so-called masters who talk a big game, flashing elaborate moves, claiming secret techniques, acting like they're untouchable. But in a real fight, that's where the truth comes out. Some of these guys genuinely believe in their own hype until they step in front of someone who actually knows what they're doing. No tricks, no theatrics, just skill, power, and a painful reality check. Starting with a man who took on the whole Chinese government to prove a point, Xu Xiaodong. In 2017, Xu Xiaodong, a Chinese MMA fighter, was on a mission to expose fake martial arts masters. He was sick of seeing these so-called grandmasters making outrageous claims about their ancient techniques being superior to modern combat sports. One of the guys who stepped up to challenge him was Wei Lei, a self-proclaimed Tai Chi master. Wei genuinely believed that his Tai Chi skills could handle a trained fighter like Xu. He wasn't alone either. Traditional martial arts had deep cultural respect in China, and a lot of people bought into the idea that these ancient techniques could still dominate in real fights. But Xu, he wasn't having any of it. He challenged Wei to a match, and the whole thing was set up to be a showdown between old-school philosophy and modern combat sports. The fight itself, a complete disaster for Wei. As soon as the match started, Xu rushed forward, went straight on the attack, and within 10 seconds, Wei was on the ground, completely out of it. It was embarrassing to say the least. He barely even had time to react before Xu overwhelmed him. He didn't use any mystical energy waves, pressure point knockouts, or legendary Tai Chi counters, just MMA domination. Now, you'd think this would just be another embarrassing loss, and people would move on. But nope, the fallout was insane. See, in China, traditional martial arts aren't just about fighting. They're a point of national pride. Having an MMA fighter expose them as ineffective, that did not sit well with the government. Instead of admitting that maybe these so-called masters weren't all that special, authorities went after Xu instead. They restricted his social media, making it harder for him to share his fights. They pressured him financially, even making it difficult for him to book venues or hold events. They wanted him to stop embarrassing traditional martial arts, but Xu didn't back down. Over the years, he kept challenging other traditional fighters, and the results were always the same. Modern fighters obliterating guys who relied on outdated techniques. The government even forced him to apologize at one point, but the damage was done. Xu proved that skill beats myth every single time. One thing that comes close to this is that time a no-touch master was exposed and led to the entire art form being questioned. There are martial arts masters who claim they can fight without actually touching anyone. Yeah, it sounds ridiculous, but these guys exist, and they have followers who genuinely believe in what they say. There was this self-proclaimed no-touch master who swore he had an energy shield that made him invincible. He wasn't just talking about dodging punches, he meant he could literally stand still, and his opponent's attacks would never land because of some mystical force protecting him. He had students, training sessions, and even demonstrations where his students would fly backward the second he waved his hand at them. To the untrained eye, it might have looked impressive, but anyone with a bit of common sense could tell something was off. Then came Alex Lee, a real fighter who didn't buy into the nonsense. The no-touch master, wanting to prove himself, invited Lee to test his ability in front of an audience. At first, Lee played along, throwing a slow and weak punch. And to be fair, the master did kind of deflect it, though it looked more like Lee was just pulling back at the last second. But then, things took a weird turn. Out of nowhere, the no-touch master slapped Lee in the face. Maybe he thought it was part of the demonstration, or maybe he was getting cocky. But whatever the reason, he made a huge mistake, because Lee, being an actual fighter, didn't take that lightly. He immediately went on the offensive, throwing real punches, fast and hard. And guess what? The so-called energy shield? Yeah, it did absolutely nothing. Every single hit landed. The master had no defense, no tricks, just an expression that screamed, "Oh no, this wasn't supposed to happen." Within seconds, the so-called unbeatable martial artist was completely exposed as a fraud. His students, who had spent years believing in his power, suddenly had to face reality. And here's the crazy part. This isn't an isolated incident. There have been whole exposés on these so-called no-touch masters who scam their students into thinking they have superhuman abilities. From fake demonstrations to staged fights where their followers pretend to be knocked out, it's all an act. But whenever they're faced with an actual fighter who isn't in on the joke, things fall apart instantly. All that proves one thing. If someone claims they can fight without ever touching their opponent, they're probably better at fooling people than actually fighting. At least these instances happened in a more private setting, to be exposed later. But some fighters are exposed in front of a live audience, kind of like what happened with Ding Hao. Ding Hao is a Wing Chun master who was convinced that his style could hold its own against modern combat sports. He wasn't just some random guy either. He genuinely believed that Wing Chun's rapid strikes and close-quarters techniques were superior to anything an MMA fighter could throw at him. So, he did what a lot of traditional martial artists were doing at the time. He stepped into the ring to prove it. But then came Peter Irving. Now, Peter wasn't just some average fighter. He had experience in Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu, meaning he was comfortable both striking and grappling. In other words, he was a nightmare matchup for someone relying on old-school Wing Chun. The fight started, and within seconds, it became clear that this wasn't going to go well for Ding Hao. Wing Chun relies heavily on trapping and deflecting incoming strikes, but Irving didn't fight by those rules. Instead of throwing predictable punches that Ding could block, Irving mixed up his attacks, using kicks, elbows, and takedowns, stuff that traditional Wing Chun just doesn't prepare you for. Ding tried to use his signature hand techniques, but they just didn't work against a trained fighter who knew how to keep distance and time his strikes. Irving started landing clean shots, breaking through Ding's defenses like they weren't even there. Before long, it was game over. The whole fight lasted 47 seconds. That's it, less than a minute, and Wing Chun was exposed. But that's not where this one ends. Yu Changhua, another Wing Chun fighter, stepped into the ring that day against Xiong Cheng, an MMA fighter with a background in kickboxing and wrestling. Like Ding Hao, Yu Changhua came from a Wing Chun lineage tracing back to Ip Man, giving him credibility in traditional martial arts circles. However, once the fight started, it became clear that tradition alone wasn't enough to deal with a trained modern fighter. From the opening bell, Xiong Cheng toyed with Yu, keeping his guard low and even fighting with one hand at times. Yu attempted slapboxing techniques and traditional Wing Chun hand movements, but they were ineffective against Xiong's striking and footwork. The MMA fighter dodged, countered, and landed clean shots while barely taking any damage himself. Yu's biggest issue was his lack of defense and adaptability. When he tried to close the distance, Xiong easily tripped him and knocked him down multiple times. Wing Chun does have low kicks and close-range techniques, but Yu barely used them, making it even easier for Xiong to dominate. At one point, Yu almost got knocked out, and if ground strikes had been allowed, the fight would have ended much sooner. His face became visibly swollen and bruised, showing how one-sided the fight was. Despite this, Yu kept getting up, showing determination, but it was clear that he was completely outclassed. Just like Ding Hao's match, this fight reinforced the idea that Wing Chun alone doesn't hold up in modern combat sports. Yu Changhua came from a respected lineage, yet he was taken apart so easily. His failure to incorporate modern techniques like head movement, proper footwork, and grappling defense made him an easy target for an MMA fighter who knew how to control range and strike effectively. Kind of like Gus Caparros. Some martial artists train for years to perfect their craft. Others, well, they just make stuff up and hope nobody calls them out. Gus Caparros fell into the second category. Gus claimed to be a lifelong martial artist with deep experience in Muay Thai and street fighting. He had the whole act down, showing off about his undefeated fights, talking about his secret training methods, and hyping up his so-called expertise. But instead of sticking to an established style, he decided to get really creative and invented his own Green Cloud Kung Fu. With enough confidence and self-promotion, he actually managed to open a martial arts school and get students to sign up. But as time went on, his followers started to notice something weird. His techniques didn't make sense. His fighting skills weren't as sharp as he claimed, and the more experienced students, they weren't learning anything useful. Eventually, enough of them got suspicious and decided to put him to the test. One of his students, who wasn't even a master, just a decent fighter, challenged Gus to prove his skills in an actual match. With an audience watching, Gus had nowhere to hide. From the moment the fight started, it was brutal. The challenger landed strikes easily, while Gus struggled to defend himself. His fancy-sounding green cloud kung fu had no answers for real, practical combat. Within moments, it became painfully obvious that he had no real experience in high-level fighting. He was completely outclassed. Things got so bad that the real master overseeing the fight had to step in to stop it. Gus was about to get completely humiliated, and the match had to end before it got worse. His reputation was destroyed. His students were done with him, and his made-up martial arts empire collapsed in on itself. Gus Caparros learned the hard way that you can talk a big game, but when it comes to fighting, reality will always expose the frauds, like this Tai Chi master got exposed. Believe it or not, Tai Chi and Muay Thai share some core principles. Both are martial arts with deep-rooted traditions, but their purposes and applications couldn't be more different. Muay Thai is all about aggression. It's often called the art of 8 limbs because fighters use punches, kicks, elbows, and knees to strike their opponents. The training is intense, fast-paced, and designed to make you fight-ready as quickly as possible. Tai Chi, on the other hand, is slower, more meditative, and focuses on fluid movements and balance. It's great for fitness and overall well-being, but it's not exactly designed for combat. This difference became crystal clear when a Tai Chi master decided to test his skills against a Muay Thai fighter. The fight wasn't drawn out. It wasn't a legendary clash of styles. It was over instantly. The Muay Thai fighter landed a single head kick, and that was it. Now, this doesn't mean Tai Chi is useless. It's an incredible practice for flexibility, relaxation, and even self-defense in certain situations. But if you think mastering Tai Chi will turn you into an unstoppable fighter, reality might hit you in person, which is something Yanagi Ruken should have thought about earlier on in his career. By now, you'd think martial artists would stop trying to convince people they can fight without actually touching anyone. But nope, there's always another so-called master who believes in energy fighting, and this one, he might be the worst of them all. Meet Master Yanagi Ruken, a man who claimed he had perfected a martial art so powerful that he didn't need to physically strike anyone to win a fight. Not only did he believe he could block attacks using an energy shield, but he also insisted he could defeat opponents without ever making contact. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, he was more than happy to prove his abilities, at least against his own students. In demonstrations, Ruken effortlessly sent his students flying with nothing but a wave of his hands. He knocked them to the ground, flipped them over, and even made them collapse before he had supposedly hit them. To the untrained eye, it looked real, but to anyone who actually understood fighting, it was clear his students were just playing along. At some point, Ruken got a little too confident. He was so convinced his abilities were real that he put up a challenge, a $5,000 reward to anyone who could defeat him in a fight. He probably expected no one to take him up on it, or at least that any challengers would also fall to his invisible strikes. That's when Iwakura, an experienced MMA fighter, stepped up. Unlike Ryuken's students, Iwakura wasn't about to fall over on command. From the moment the fight started, it was obvious Ryuken had zero real skill. Iwakura landed clean, effortless strikes, and Ryuken, he had no answer. His so-called energy shield did nothing. He barely even managed to move before getting punched and taken down repeatedly. At one point, Iwakura showed a little mercy, likely realizing that Ruken had no idea what he was doing. But the damage was done. The so-called master had been completely humiliated, his supposed unbeatable style exposed as a fraud. It's honestly one of the funniest martial arts beatdowns ever caught on camera. And if there's one thing this proves, it's that yes, you can. Touch this. But what about a karate versus MMA takedown? Before anyone starts freaking out, yes, karate is a legitimate martial art. art. It's been around for centuries, and plenty of people train in it for self-defense. It does work, but here's the thing. Just because you have a black belt doesn't mean you're automatically going to destroy every opponent you face. This becomes especially clear when you put a traditional martial artist up against an MMA fighter. See, MMA is about constant training, full contact sparring, and preparing for real, high-pressure fights. MMA fighters don't just practice moves, they practice how to apply them against opponents who are also highly trained and actively resisting. In this particular fight, we have a karate black belt going up against an experienced MMA fighter, and, well, it doesn't go well for the karate guy. Now, don't get me wrong, he's not clueless. He lands a few hits and clearly has skill in his own discipline. But once the MMA fighter starts mixing things up with different striking angles, clinches, and takedowns, it's game over. The MMA fighter doesn't just hit him, he controls the fight, adapting in ways that the karate fighter simply isn't prepared for. Grappling, counters, and sheer experience make the difference here. Against an untrained opponent, the karate black belt probably would have done just fine, but against someone who trains daily to fight against a variety of styles, that's a different story. And that's why MMA is one of the toughest combat sports in the world. It forces fighters to be well-rounded, adaptable, and prepared for anything. The reason fights like this go the way they do is because traditional martial arts, including karate, often lack live sparring against fully resisting opponents. Many karate schools focus on kata, which are prearranged movements, and point sparring, which teaches speed and accuracy, but not necessarily the ability to deal with a real, aggressive attacker. Meanwhile, MMA is built on pressure testing. Fighters spend hours sparring, drilling counters, and learning how to escape bad positions. They train in multiple disciplines: Muay Thai for striking, wrestling for takedowns, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for submissions, which makes them adaptable in ways that a single discipline fighter often isn't. That's not to say karate is useless. There have been successful MMA fighters with karate backgrounds, like Lyoto Machida and Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, but even they had to evolve beyond pure karate and incorporate techniques from other combat sports. At the end of the day, it's not about which martial art is better, it's about how you train, and in a full contact fight, adaptability wins. And the fight between a Tai Chi kickboxer versus Kung Fu master proved that. Lei, best known as Xu Xiaodong's first opponent, stepped into the ring again, this time with some kickboxing training under his belt. Facing off against a Kung Fu practitioner, many hoped he would redeem himself after his disastrous loss to Xu. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. From the start, it was clear that Lei's kickboxing skills were lacking. His opponent, while bigger in size, wasn't technically impressive either, throwing wide, looping punches instead of crisp strikes. But Lei struggled just the same. He kept his hands low, barely threw any kicks, and relied too much on covering up instead of countering. As the fight went on, Lei got knocked down multiple times. He attempted some clinching, but showed zero grappling skills. Even when opportunities arose to use his kickboxing, he hesitated. His opponent, despite his sloppy style, pressed forward with aggression, landing punches and forcing Lei on the defensive. If the loss to Xu Xiaodong exposed the flaws of Lei's Chi-based Tai Chi, this fight showed that even with modern training, he still struggled in real combat. His year of kickboxing practice didn't translate well into the ring, possibly due to poor training or lack of real sparring. Despite another defeat, Lei deserves credit for stepping into the ring again. But if he wants to compete seriously, he needs to fight opponents his size and sharpen his fundamentals, especially his striking, footwork, and defense. Otherwise, he risks becoming a cautionary tale of martial arts myth versus reality 2 times over. Maybe our next master, Master Nam Huindao, should take a page out of the same book of lessons. Master Hu has built an empire on nonsense, and somehow people are buying it. This self-proclaimed grandmaster of Nam Huindao runs over 20 dojos across Vietnam and Southeast Asia, boasting 7,000 students. But instead of teaching martial arts, he's basically running a slap factory where students line up to get smacked in the face and then applaud him for the privilege. If that's not some next-level cult behavior, I don't know know what is. The man doesn't just stop at slaps though. No, he also chokes his students. And guess what? They applaud that too. At this point, he could probably roundhouse kick someone off a balcony and they'd still give him a standing ovation. The real question is, what doesn't this guy get a round of applause for? Tying his shoes, taking a sip of water, filing his taxes, and let's talk about his fashion choices. The man has been through more wardrobe changes than a pop star on tour. He started in what looked like a farmer's outfit, upgraded to business casual, then went full Dwight Schrute, and finally evolved into some kung fu movie villain attire. Apparently, once he put on the suit, the chai powers magically kicked in. Makes sense. Everyone knows a well-fitted suit makes you unstoppable. But of course, the chi magic falls apart when someone actually challenges him to a fight. A Canadian Wing Chun master, Francois Flores, flew all the way to Vietnam just to throw hands with Master Hugh. And in the least surprising news ever, Hugh declined. Instead, a traditional karate instructor named Duan Baocho stepped up and got absolutely wrecked. Safe to say, if Master Hugh had taken the challenge, he'd probably still be asleep on the mat today. But here's the most shocking part. This guy conned his way into Vietnam's school system. That's right, he's teaching kids his made-up nonsense. If he can convince thousands of grown adults to let him slap them around, imagine how easy it'll be to trick a bunch of kids. He didn't just start a fake martial art, he started a full-on Jedi mind trick empire. The sad part, he's not even the first. People lined up to get slapped by Antonio Inoki, and some Brazilian jiu-jitsu schools have ritual belt-whipping ceremonies. At what point does tradition just turn into getting scammed? Master Hugh is out here proving one thing. If you act confident enough, people will believe anything, even that getting slapped in the face is an honor. Kinda like Master Ma Baoguo thinks he's the smartest man in the world. Master Ma is one of the most notorious martial arts frauds out of China, but to understand just how ridiculous his story is, we need to go back to where it all started, his first fight. In 2015, Master Ma released footage of himself supposedly defeating professional fighter Peter Irving. The video made waves, with Ma claiming it was a legitimate fight, but Irving later exposed the truth. The whole thing was staged. Irving had been hired as an actor for what he believed was a private tribute video, only to find out later that Ma had edited the footage and claimed victory. Once the deception came to light, Irving laughed it off, calling Ma's claims ridiculous, and even offering to take an MMA team to fight at Ma's school. After the fallout from the Peter Irving debacle, Ma decided to go after a bigger name, Xu Xiaodong, the MMA fighter famous for exposing fake martial artists in China. In 2020, a fight between the two was scheduled, but it never happened. 30 minutes before the match, police shut it down due to lack of proper paperwork. Ma immediately declared victory, claiming his spiritual powers had stopped Xu from fighting. In reality, leaked texts revealed Ma had begged his nephew to call the police, fearing he would be seriously injured. Later that year, Ma finally agreed to a real fight against 50-year-old MMA hobbyist Wang Qingmin. It went exactly as expected. Ma was knocked out in 40 seconds. Shortly after, a martial arts association in China publicly disowned him, stating he had no legitimate ties to their style and threatening legal action against anyone who continued to associate him with their name. But even after getting humiliated, Ma refused to admit defeat. Instead, he claimed he had been poisoned before the match. After becoming the internet's favorite martial arts meme, with people editing him into movies and dance videos, Ma seemingly retired. He posted a statement on Weibo announcing his departure from the martial arts world. But instead of disappearing, he reinvented himself as the godfather of nightclubs, performing staged martial arts routines at clubs for $28,000 per show. From fake fights to nightclub performances, Ma has turned his fraudulence into a business. He might not have mastered martial arts, but he certainly mastered making money off his own delusions. Which one of these secret kung fu masters would you want to take lessons from?